Excited to be here with Rob Knake and having a conversation about cybersecurity and why cyber attacks aren't just for the enterprise. Rob, thanks for joining us.
Oh, happy to do it as always, Rob.
All right, we also have Shanna with us. Shanna, why don't you do a quick introduction?
I am Shanna like banana. I am the success manager here at Defendify. So if you are a Defendify partner, we've probably worked together. And I am the moderator and cybercrime hater.
Thank you so much for doing that. Rob, you ready to roll?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, let's start off with a little introduction. So Rob, obviously everyone saw in the first slide a little bit about yourself, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your history? And I think people are going to be really interested in understanding, how you obtained a director role, on the cybersecurity side at the White House. Maybe you can tell us a little bit of your story and background.
I got into the field kind of pretty much out of college, looking at cybersecurity as a threat alongside Homeland Security. What were terrorists going to do on the World Wide Web? What were criminal groups doing? So that kind of became an academic research focus of mine in the think tank world, and pursued that into grad school and then into the consulting world, where in the early 2000s, cybersecurity was just coming on the radar of most companies, and so got some really great exposure working with companies on cybersecurity. And then I had the opportunity to go into government at the start of the Obama administration and spent about a year at Homeland Security in what is now the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, but back then was a very small office handling cybersecurity at the department. And then from there, I went and I was detailed, which government speak for lent, to the National Security Council for about 4 years, where I was developing cyber policy at a national level from 2011 through 2015 or so.
Awesome. And so maybe would you be open to sharing a little bit about some of the special projects that possibly you worked on, with the group here? Anything of key interest?
Yeah, I mean, so there were two sides to the office when I was there. There was the defensive side, the good side, and then there was the offensive side, the intel side, the dark realm that was overseen by a guy we called the evil cyber lord. I worked on the other side of that. I worked on the good side, the defensive side, and so most everything that I did is something I can talk about. Programs that ended up becoming public, efforts to try and bring the private sector and the government closer together to build partnerships. And so, on that basis, happy to talk about most of what I did. I see the thing that I did and my team did that probably had the longest lasting impact was to conceive of and see through the development of the National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework, what some people in the industry now just call the framework, right? And this was an effort to say, okay, we need to bring together a consensus view on what the expectations are for cybersecurity. What does it mean to achieve some level of cybersecurity? What should a company expect its vendors to do on the cybersecurity front? What's reasonable for a government agency to expect regulated entities to do? And so the cybersecurity framework was really the first effort of the government to create a standard of care on cybersecurity. And I think the impact of that ended up being far more reaching than I think any of us expected at the time. To see it now used so widely at all levels of the private sector has really been kind of remarkable and very surprising.
Yeah, on the leading front on all aspects, especially now with 800-171 and so forth. Yeah, that's great. So tell us a little bit. So in 2015, the cyber fight has to be a lot different in government or public sector, private sector, compared to today. How has that battle changed in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's so remarkable, if you look at it from the perspective of government, of the perspective of the intelligence community to the defense community. When I was in government, 5 years ago, we were dealing with incredibly sophisticated threats and capabilities that were only in the hands of a very small number of nation state actors. Russia, China were the two big adversaries out there. What's changed in the last 5 years is the growing sophistication of these criminal groups that are in many ways every bit as sophisticated as what we dub the advanced persistent threat actors like China and Russia. I mean, these criminal groups are well organized, they're focused, they're targeting private companies, and they're bringing capabilities to the table that 5 years ago were really only in the hands of a small number of companies. I think what's been really surprising to me to see over the last few years is that kind of approach where these organizations have multiple dedicated people with advanced capabilities working in a concerted fashion over many months to achieve their goal. In this case, it's often deploying ransomware or stealing trade secrets, things like that for criminal gain. They're doing it for incredibly small targets. We're seeing that kind of capability that would have been a nation state against another nation state now being a criminal group against a small to medium-sized business in some cases. They're using capabilities to extract a $250,000 ransom. So that is a massive change over the last 5 years.
Right, and setting that ransom amount at like the perfect amount so that somebody looks at that and says, "Oh my goodness, it's not $10 million, it's 250,000." Makes it difficult. Let's go into a poll question, Shanna. We're going to pass it over to you and start the polls. Do you mind jumping in here?
I don't mind at all. So we've launched this first polling question here. Who is specifically responsible for leading cybersecurity at your company? So we have a business executive such as the owner, CEO, COO, a technology executive such as a CIO, a CISO, CSO, CTO, IT director or IT manager, or we have an outsourced provider, so either a managed service provider or a managed security service provider.
I think it's an interesting poll question to see, in different organizations, if the roles are sitting in these different groups. I think it would be great to see how everyone responds here.
All right, so we're going to share these results here. 50% are the business executives, 8% a technology executive.
I think that's really interesting. I think that technology executive is going to continue to grow, especially in small to mid-sized companies. Hey, Rob, so let's start talking about enterprise organizations. I think it's a great place to begin. So a lot of these technology executives are inside of those groups. Cybersecurity is becoming a boardroom conversation more and more often. What are some of the challenges that you see in enterprise organizations today on the cybersecurity side?
I think the surprising one, and this is something that is kind of coming up from the small and medium-sized businesses to the enterprise level, are ransomware attacks. Ransomware started when it began as targeting individual users, right? It was about your grandmother's rickety old computer that she's had for 10 years that has never been updated, and she's got her old AOL account that's offering no protection, and so somebody drops a phishing email, she clicks on it, computer gets infected, and in order to get her photos of her grandkids back, she's extorted for $300, right? That's how ransomware began. A couple of years back, we started seeing that move up to small businesses, and the level of ransoms that we were just talking about, 250,000 or so. Now we're seeing the sophistication of these criminal groups has grown. That threat is now hitting the enterprise. We're seeing multi-million-dollar ransom demands. We're seeing whole networks taken down. We're seeing companies, very large companies, paralyzed by ransomware. And so that's kind of one of the more surprising things that has emerged. And it's really one of the more difficult ones to deal with because it has that direct impact for a lot of enterprise CISOs, right? The things that they were worried about were things that nobody could really see, right? Were you targeted by Chinese operators who wanted to steal your intellectual property? that'd be really hard to find out. If you didn't discover it yourself, you were dependent on the FBI knocking on your door and telling you that they found some evidence that this had happened, that the intelligence community had found that out, right? And so you were looking for this sort of almost unknowable thing to know whether or not you were secure. And now with ransomware, we're seeing on top of that, this very immediate impact that's completely changing the game. And the difficult part for many CISOs at these large enterprises is they've really set up their organizations to deal with that threat of long-term sustained campaigns to steal data. They weren't really set up to deal with a whole bunch of their computers getting infected and getting locked up very, very quickly. And so it's required fundamentally shifting their approach to cybersecurity.
How about the extortion side of that we're seeing on the ransomware, where they're obtaining the documents and then, holding those out and saying, if you don't pay us the ransom, we're gonna, release these documents. Is that a trend that you're seeing increasing?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, so it's I think a very interesting approach. Most of the time, these ransomware operators, they have a good sense of how your company is doing, how big you are going in, right? They're doing everything that a good sales executive is doing before reaching out to a customer. Before they target you with ransomware, they're going to know, how big you are, how many employees you have, all the data they can find on your funding or on your revenue. And they're going to make a ransom demand that's going to be in line with what they found out. And then a lot of the time, once they're in, they're going to try and figure out, how much money do you have in your bank account, right? And if they're not going to be able to execute a transfer on their own, if they don't have that level of penetration and access, they're at least going to figure out, what's your bank balance, and they're going to use that to determine whether you can pay the ransom. And if you refuse to pay, right, they're not going to go away and say, okay, you lost your data, good luck with backups. They're going to take the data that they've locked up, they're going to have already exfiltrated some of it, and then they're going to share that out with the world. They're going to let the world know, hey, we hacked this company, we got their data. They may also, as we've been seeing, sell that data on the dark web. They may go to other criminals and say, hey, we don't really know what to do with this, but we're going to auction this data off, and you can find ways to monetize it by targeting their customers, by selling it to their competitors, things like that. And so it's a very scary world that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's definitely changing it for sure. And we're going to talk a little bit later in the conversation around, how are these ransomware attacks actually being successful if people have technology deployed and they're protecting themselves? What about other types of attacks? So ransomware for sure. Are you seeing any other key things that are facing enterprise organizations today? Is the insider threat and so forth, or are those things that they're facing and concerned about?
Well, I mean, I think given the news of the last couple of days, we got to talk about the SolarWinds attack, right? And that's really what people are dubbing a supply chain attack. This is the tough thing. If you're a CISO of a large enterprise, and if you're a small business, this is the risk that you pose to those large enterprises. In the case of the SolarWinds attack, right? The SolarWinds, a large IT management software company, was compromised by Russian hackers. They weren't the ultimate target of that hack. The goal was to use their access to government agencies and to Fortune 500 companies, of which I think they're in, at least 2/3 of those in most federal agencies, to use their update channel to push malware into those environments and give them access to those customers of SolarWinds networks. And so this kind of supply chain attack has, always been a major concern that was kind of out there for the last 10 or 20 years. Up until now, I think most of the time, Russian hackers, Chinese hackers didn't need to carry out a supply chain attack to get into a network, right? Spear phishing would work, right? Mm-hmm. But as defenses have tightened, they've had to find other channels into these organizations, and they found a very good one with this supply chain attack, and have just compromised what seems like half the world at this point.
Yeah, as it feels like it's going to continue between the software and hardware, and that is a key approach. And the governments are scrambling right now to get all that software out of their systems and review all the activity and so forth, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a massive undertaking. I mean, it's a really tough point because we kind of felt like we were, on the upswing, having gotten through the 2020 election, thought we thwarted the Russians from changing votes, from carrying out a campaign of data manipulation and exposure that might have changed the election outcome. And so I think everybody's been feeling pretty good about that. And then to get hit with this news that some of the best protected organizations in the private sector and government had been owned by this Russian threat group for so long is pretty depressing.
Yeah. Let's go to the next poll question. We're going to pass over to Shanna again. Shanna, do you want to jump on this one for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've launched this poll. How do you rate the level of cybersecurity maturity at your company? So we have 1 for low maturity, all the way up to a 5 for high maturity.
Shanna, as you know, when we talk to a lot of organizations, sometimes the feedback is, what cybersecurity program?
Or I think somebody else handles that.
Right.
All right, so we have 9% would rate themselves a low 1 maturity, about 27% for a 2, 36%. So a lot of people kind of went middle of the road there. 9% at 4 and 18% at 5, the highest maturity.
Well, you got to start somewhere. So it's great to see people continuing to improve here. Rob, let's go on to the next point here, and we'll move away from the enterprise organizations and start talking about small and mid-sized businesses. So, is there a change that you've seen over the years where these attacks are focusing on small business, differently and maybe more often than before? What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. As I said, I think ransomware has been something that actually, instead of coming down from the enterprise, has come up from the individual users and started to target small businesses. But then there's the reality that the tactics that worked against grandma's email account and her 10-year-old computer don't work against a small business that's got good IT hygiene that hadn't even really thought about cybersecurity. And so those attacks have required a higher degree of sophistication, going from our kind of script kiddie here to
Mm-hmm.
at least a level 1 or level 2, an intermediate organization, just to get in the door. And now what we're seeing is that these more sophisticated groups are both moving down, and those less sophisticated groups are improving their capability. And so we're seeing small to medium-sized businesses targeted by very sophisticated capabilities, the kind of capabilities that's, as I said, you would have 5 years ago said, oh, that's a nation state level capability. Well, it's not anymore. And I think that's a pretty scary thing for many people to realize. I think a lot of companies, when I go out and talk about cybersecurity, they when I was in government, they'd have an approach which was essentially like, well, our responsibility is cybercrime, and we'll do the equivalent of the locks on the doors and the alarm system. But if it's the nation state, that's not my problem. That's your problem. That's what I pay taxes for. The reality is today, right, you can't really differentiate between the nation state level threat and the criminal threat. The criminal threat is every bit as good. And if you've got something that they want, they're going to do things to get it that previously we would have said, oh, only the Russian and Chinese intelligence and military agencies have those capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're talking about just on ransomware alone, billions and billions of dollars being fed into those attackers. So of course they're going to be more sophisticated when they're making tons of money off of those attacks, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. Yeah. And this is part of the reason that I've pushed back against organizations paying ransoms, because every time you pay a ransom, some of that money goes to buy leather jackets and Lamborghinis in Vukovar or in Moscow or in Kiev. But some of the rest of that money is reinvested in the organization to hire new hackers with more advanced capabilities or differentiated capabilities and bring them on the team. And so, from that perspective, those dollars that companies pay when they've been hit by ransom are increasing the threat for everybody else. They're making it a more attractive market to enter, to bring more sophisticated capabilities. And so, if you think about it as an arms race, it's the victims of ransomware that are funding that arms race. And it's a terrifying prospect to realize that right now we're seeing unique attacks using unique malware targeting middle market companies. The kind of thing that you would have said, we don't see 0-day attacks being used against a mid-sized business. That's not worth it. Well, we're now seeing that. We're seeing some of these groups are employing 0 days, unknown vulnerabilities that nobody else is aware of, that nobody else has seen, to extort a couple $1 million ransom. And as they get better at that, they'll start extorting a $250,000 ransom with that technique. That'll be a couple years away at this point. And it really is increasing the vulnerability for all of us for this kind of continued funding to go to these groups.
Right. So we know that, small businesses today, because especially here at Defendify, we've looked under the hoods of lots and lots of them and tried to help them improve their cyber posture. But, I would have to say the majority of them are relying on sort of antiquated protection. Antivirus and a firewall is to the extent for many of them. Based on what you're sharing with us, do you feel that that's enough today?
No, I mean, I think that antivirus and firewall, they have their roles to play, right? They're gonna reduce that lowest level of threat. Your traditional antivirus is gonna block known patterns of malware. It's not gonna block unknown patterns of malware. And what we've seen is that even at this market level, these attackers are gonna test everything that they're going to deploy against these companies before they deploy it. They're going to know whether most of the AV products on the market are going to be able to detect them and block them. And if they are, they're going to make adjustments until they pass that test. So, think about VirusTotal, right? A tool you can use to drop any URL or any file off of the internet or off your computer into an engine that's going to test it against, I think, 30 or 40 at this point, different AV engines. Well, the criminals, some of them will just use VirusTotal, but because you can get a feed off of that to block those attacks if you're a defender now, the dark web has the same offerings available. And so, you pay a little bit of money as a ransomware operator, you drop your payload into a service like VirusTotal on the dark web, you figure out, hey, is it getting stopped by Symantec or Sophos or McAfee or what have you? And if it does, you tinker with it until it's no longer detected. And so that's the kind of scenario where you just got to say, even the most advanced antivirus today isn't going to do it. These attackers are, even for the things that we call behavioral antivirus, where they're looking for how the virus behaves, not just trying to match it with a signature.
Right.
They're making sure that they're avoiding those, that they're not going to get blocked, that at most they're going to get detected and an alert of something suspicious happening. But in order for an organization to make use of that kind of tooling, somebody's got to be watching it. Somebody's got to be monitoring it. Somebody's got to be knowing what it means and being able to investigate it. And so from that perspective, just the sort of static defense of antivirus and firewalls is no longer a workable solution for a large, small business.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. I think it's interesting about the behavioral based endpoint protection, and they're designed to sort of discover anomalies that are occurring. So let's dive a little bit more in there. So how exactly is that being defeated? You're saying that it's simply going to send an alert. Can you expand a little bit more on that, Rob, for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, so because these companies don't want to set essentially the risk rating they assign to each piece of software or each activity at such a level where it would automatically seize up your computer, quarantine it, and block it every time they detect something slightly suspicious. And instead of blocking it, they're going to set up an alert. They're going to say, we observed this suspicious activity. It may be nothing. go investigate it. Well, who's gonna investigate it? All these programs are now detecting what people call living off the land attacks, right? Where an adversary, once they've gained access to your system, maybe through a file they sent to you, spear phishing, maybe through a link, maybe just through credentials they found on the dark web, sold by somebody else. Once they get a foothold on your network, they're going to try and live off the land. They're not going to download other tools to move around. They're going to use IT administrative tools in order to execute their campaign and get off their first compromised system and move to other areas of the network so they can carry out whatever their objective is, whether it's stealing information or conducting a ransomware campaign that's going to seize up the whole network. They're going to really try not to trip over these kinds of static protections like antivirus and firewalls. And so, what a lot of these AV vendors are doing is now they're going to send an alert, anytime they see something that could be that, right? So you use PowerShell, right? A typical utility on every Windows box for doing IT administration. Anytime that's used, they're going to say, suspicious activity, we saw PowerShell. Well, if you've got one person doing IT at a 600-person company, good luck responding to every time that happens. How are you gonna investigate that, right? You pick up the phone and call the person who owns the computer. Hey, did you use PowerShell for something? No? Okay, I'm gonna call my MSP now. Hey, were you guys doing any administration this morning? No, you weren't. Okay, so yeah, this does look suspicious. Well, you can't do that every single time you get one of these alerts, right? We're suffering from what everybody in the industry calls alert fatigue. And so most IT people are just forced to ignore all those alerts, and they become really useful after the fact for forensics when you want to figure out, once the ransomware happened, how they get in, what they do, but not so useful for stopping them unless you have somebody whose job it is to not only piece the case together, but to figure out if it is actually not a false positive, if it's a true positive, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to contain the threat? How are you going to eradicate them, right? That's a capability that most IT shops just simply don't have.
Right. A 400-person company has a couple IT people there, and they don't necessarily, not always, have the resources, the people, or the tools to be able to do that forensic analysis and really dive in and understand how to ensure that this isn't a compromise that's currently in place.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great, Rob. Thanks for sharing that with us. So you mentioned it a couple times, and I think we already answered the question, but I want to see if there's anything that we missed here. But, would an APT, maybe first off, let's take a step back and maybe just define for some folks who are on this who may not understand what an APT is or a 0 day. Maybe you can just define that for us first, and then I'll ask you my follow-up question. Do you mind?
Sure. So APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. This was a term of art that the Cybersecurity Mandiant, now part of FireEye, came up with to describe a class of actors from nation states, principally Russia and China at the time, and they started numbering them. So I think we're probably at APT 137 or something like that at this point. But it was to describe these adversaries where they had this advanced level of capability, yes, but the main thing was they were persistent. They had a goal and they were going to achieve it, and they were willing to take time to do that. And so they were going to be very targeted, very focused. They were going to be persistent about getting onto your network. And then once on your network, they were going to persist while they were there. They were going to work to maintain their access, to make sure that they weren't discovered, to make sure that they had multiple ways to get on and off of your network, so that they could dwell there for an extended period of time to collect the data that they wanted to collect or carry out whatever other actions they wanted to capture when the time was right. And so that's the concept of an APT. Now, the idea of a 0 day, this is the idea of a vulnerability that nobody else is aware of, where they've spent money and time either hiring researchers or developing themselves to find a bug in software that can be exploited, that they can use to gain access to your network, or once they've gained access to your network, to get off of an initial compromised system onto other systems. And so 0 days are sort of the coin of the realm in cybersecurity. They're immensely valuable for a major operating system, for a major phone system like iOS or Android. And we've started to see well-protected small and medium-sized businesses, if these adversaries can't get into them using known vulnerabilities, using known techniques, they've been willing to employ a 0-day to gain access to these networks, not for the purpose of doing anything explicitly to those companies, but using them as a pathway to their larger customers, which might be government agencies or might be large enterprises.
Right. It's all about ROI, isn't it? Like how much you're going to invest in time, energy, resources, and what the return is going to be. And if you're going to do and utilize one of your 0 days, because if it is ever discovered, then that's sort of finished at that point in time. It's all about ROI, is it not?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to think about it on a one-on-one basis, right? If I'm trying to extract a $250,000 ransom from a company, I'm not going to blow a $1 million 0-day that I bought from a dark web operator on that, right? On the other hand, if I think I can carry out 5 campaigns at once and extract 5 $250,000 ransoms from 5 companies, hey, I just got a 25% return on my investment. And so if I can carry those out all at once before anybody discovers this vulnerability, before anybody has anything to do about it, I'm going to do that. And so that's just at the cutting edge of what we're starting to see. I think at this point, it's mostly we're seeing in the criminal world, the use of 0 days has been reserved for those larger ransoms where it's a $4 million, $10 million ransom that they're seeking. And these operators have been willing to burn a 0-day in order to achieve that kind of level of payout.
Yeah. And, we talked earlier about the supply chain, right? And, those small businesses may be entry points into larger entities, or they may be storing sensitive data of their customers who might be enterprise organizations. And so, we're seeing a lot of that enterprise third-party vendor assessments being pushed down to those small businesses for those risks, for these exact same reasons that you're sharing. That's great. All right, so let's go back to the enterprise organizations again. So we talked about antivirus, endpoint protection, firewalls, and that they may not be enough even for a small business today, based on the types of adversaries that might be going after them. What's an enterprise organization look like today? What are they doing to protect themselves, Rob?
Well, I think the enterprises are looking at cybersecurity from a couple different angles. One is from a maturity angle. We've talked a little bit about that. We asked everybody to rate their own maturity, but enterprises are taking models like the Department of Defense's cybersecurity maturity model certification program, and they're really figuring out, okay, of the 5 levels, where are we on that? Where do we need to be? What are the controls we have implemented against each of the requirements in this maturity model? What are the ones that we need to beef up? What are the ones that we need to adopt that we haven't yet in order to get to the level of maturity that we think we need to get to? So that's the first piece of it. And I think doing that, you see a lot of companies say, okay, there are specific technologies or programs or capabilities we need to build. We need to have a better understanding of intelligence. We need to put in place endpoint security. We need to think about the security of our servers. That's one approach. The other approach is this idea of the kill chain, right? It's the idea of saying, okay, let's base our security program on how the threat actors target us, how they move from their reconnaissance, where they're doing online research, through towards choosing what tools they're going to target us with, how they're going to deliver that to us. Typically, it's through email still, but as we saw with SolarWinds, maybe through the supply chain of a large vendor or a small vendor that you use. And then once you're inside, how are they going to move across the network and carry out the action zone objectives that they want, whether that's exfiltrating information or whether it's ransomware. And so what large enterprises are doing is they're looking at that 5-point stage in the basic kill chain model, or blown out to 14 stages in MITRE's attack framework. And they're saying, how do we censor our network? How do we censor our endpoints? How do we put in place protections so we can stop and detect adversaries at every single point on that chain, so that if they make one mistake, we're going to catch them. We'll have an opportunity to mess up and miss them as many times as they try, as long as we get one shot at detecting and stopping them. And so that's the approach that we're seeing. Now, what that's led most of these large companies to do is to develop what we call a threat hunting capability, to think about, okay, we got to have sensors everywhere on our network along that kill chain. And then we've got to be able to detect their activity, make sense of that data, and then respond rapidly when we detect something. And so that's where this idea of detection and response has really grown in the last couple of years.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit about, security operations teams and detection and response. What does an enterprise organization look like today? What's the team consist of? And obviously the size is going to vary depending on, what they're trying to protect and how many employees and endpoints and the whole bit. But can you share for everyone here what enterprise groups look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the level of differentiation we're seeing in enterprise SOCs today is just amazing. I mean, you've got, in some models, you might say you've got your typical security operations center, and what they're dealing with is just the alerts coming in and responding to those alerts all day long. Then you're going to have a threat intelligence group that's set up to scour open source, to take in dark web intelligence, to take in feeds from vendors, to understand how adversaries are targeting their networks, to figure out what tactics, techniques, and procedures those organizations are going to use, and to figure out how those TTPs can be detected. And then they're going to feed that to the threat hunting group. And the threat hunting group is going to go look for those TTPs across the network. And then we're seeing in the largest organizations a specific and focused incident response group, whose job it is all day long is to do nothing but respond to the incidents that are getting escalated from the SOC, that are getting identified by the threat hunt team from that threat intelligence group. And so, now we're talking about, massive organizations that are just trying to fuse huge amounts of data together in order to protect these enterprises. And then add to that, and this is going to get amplified after SolarWinds, a new group that is just responsible for third-party cybersecurity, that's just responsible for supply chain cybersecurity, that is doing the assessments and monitoring in real time the security of their sometimes their customer base and always their vendor base. And so these are just massive organizations that are in a large organizations are growing into the thousands.
Right. And especially on the third-party risk side too, as you shared, those groups are becoming monstrous. So you mentioned earlier about false positives and all these alerts rolling in. That is happening at an astronomical rate. In an enterprise organization, it's got to be nonstop, teams looking in, investigating the whole bit. It takes a significant team and resources to assess that. It's not at a point today, nor are we any close to saying those are eliminated, right?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that the reality is that some of the most advanced capabilities in data science today are being used to tackle these problems. And right. In large enterprises, they're using off-the-shelf technology from other vendors, but many of these large organizations are building their own capabilities. They're building their own data science teams for the purpose of improving their detection and response to cyber threats, because right now it is, it's not a needle in a stack of, in a haystack, it's a needle in a stack of needles is the expression, right? Everything is being alerted on as being bad, and you got to figure out, well, what actually is the needle you need to find.
All right, so we know what enterprise organizations are doing, and so we also know that small and mid-sized companies are having more sophisticated attacks that antivirus and firewalls not enough of. So how can a small business build somewhat similar capabilities of an enterprise organization SOC? How can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, so everything we're talking about, right? I mean, that's the one percenters of the cybersecurity world, to borrow a phrase from Richard Balick, who describes himself as a member of the 1%, right? He was at GE Security for any number of years. He was at the Air Force before that. He was at Mandiant and FireEye. And he says, yeah, there's no way that your average mid or small sized business in America can emulate what we're doing, what the security 1% are doing. You can't build that on your own. And so, I mean, what we're really seeing is this trend towards outsourcing, the development of more advanced managed security service providers, the development of managed detection and response, where instead of having your own dedicated team at your organization, you're going to get a dedicated team at a third-party service provider, and they're going to provide this service for you and 100 other companies that look just like you, and that's going to allow you to have the kind of capabilities that previously only the GEs or the JP Morgans of the world could have.
Right. And so outsourcing that to the resources that are there at a cost-effective manner, because the expenses are split amongst a number of different teams. There's got to be some benefits in having threat intelligence shared amongst each organization as well, right? So if there's a detection at one company, that could be sort of shared amongst threat hunting with the others.
No doubt. I mean, I think, and there's two pieces to that threat intelligence. One is just, if you want to really build a good threat intelligence capability at your own organization, good luck. Sign a check for $20 million and parse that out to all the major vendors in the field, and you'll begin to get a sense of the threats that you may be facing as an organization. Step back from that, the most valuable thing that you're going to get from this kind of outsourced relationship is the intelligence that your vendor is going to be harvesting from all their other customers, right? When they find a threat at a customer that's very similar to yours in the same market segment and the same geography, and they can harvest intelligence from that and use it to protect you, that's absolutely invaluable.
Right. And I think one of the key things for a small to mid-sized organization, which we shared earlier, is that, they probably have IT resources in-house or an MSP that they're working with, but it's not necessarily the fact that they have, security experts, cybersecurity experts on staff who can forensically identify, investigate, threat hunt, and then contain and remediate that problem. That's a big issue as well. So that that outsourced security operations center, that outsourced breach detection and response, it can offer those types of benefits as well, where cybersecurity experts can contain and respond and remediate, and then provide analysis on the end side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the traditional criticism of the MSSP was, essentially you'd get a phone call from your MSP provider that would say, there's a serial killer in your house, good luck finding it. And they'd hang up the phone, right? They'd monitor your systems. They'd tell you had a problem. There wasn't anything that they were equipped to do about it. And so that's where there's a degree to which endpoint detection and response as a technology has just been revolutionary for the field, because it allows a third party not only to detect a problem, but to take actions to mitigate that problem remotely and quickly. And so, that's the technology, and that's the kind of approach that has overtaken the industry in the last couple of years. You need to pair detection and response very, very tightly together. That you can't turn to the IT person at a 400-person firm and say, we believe that you've been infected by this advanced group. Go see what you can do to quarantine those machines and get them out of your network, right? That's not something that IT person is trained to do. It's not something they're going to be capable of doing.
Right. And so that outsourced group can really help them through that. Excellent. That's great. I think that's really beneficial for small to mid-size folks to understand that there are options out there for them to improve their maturity level. I thought this would be an interesting question about 2021. Where are people focusing their improvements? Are they putting budgets in a specific category? Do they think they need to improve on employee awareness? We know that majority of cyber attacks start with phishing emails and so on. It'd be great to hear from the group here in regards to where are you focusing 2021? Where are you planning to make cybersecurity improvements? As a group here, it'd be great for everyone to look and see where people are really making some key changes. I've got to think that compliance is going to be a big one, especially with CMMC coming around. A lot of groups looking at that right now.
That is what we are hearing, the compliance like regulatory compliance requirements, and also that third-party push down that we've been talking about all day.
Right.
Few votes for endpoint protection, perimeter protection, testing, and scanning. A lot of people looking at password management, detection and response. Employee training and awareness is a clear leader there. Meeting compliance requirements, about 50% of participants said that that was a concern. And policies and plans.
Excellent, that's great. Yeah, I think those three key areas is, getting credentials under control, some form of 24/7 detection and response, and the employee training. Interesting. And 50% of responders about the compliance. Wow. All right, great. All right, we're going to go to asking Rob about your book a little bit. This is your second book, and my question to you is, what led you to writing a second book? You already did one before. Why'd you do another one?
Yeah, so I mean, when we wrote the first book, Cyber War, it was really a wake-up call. I mean, we wrote it in 2009, 2010, when cybersecurity really wasn't on the national radar. It wasn't even really on the national security radar. Cyber Command at the Department of Defense did not exist at that time. There was no cyber coordinator in the White House. This was not an issue that people really focused on. And so we wrote Cyber War as sort of the next threat to national security, where we were just trying to raise awareness. We were just trying to get people concerned about the issue. We wrote the fifth domain really, after I got out of government. I realized that there was this very negative view of cybersecurity. This was just this hopeless situation. There were two kinds of companies: those who've been hacked and know it, and those that have been hacked and don't know it. And the intelligence I'd seen and some of the companies I worked with suggested there actually was a third kind of company. There were companies that knew they were being targeted and were actively working every day to thwart those attackers, and many were succeeding for exceedingly long stretches, years at a time between breaches, even though they were being hammered on every day. And so the fifth domain was really about that story, the idea that companies actually are managing this. This is possible, and this is something that you could do even against the most aggressive nation state hackers. And so from that perspective, that was the story I wanted to tell, was, how do you actually do this? It can be done. How do you do it? And how do you move it from the very small number of companies that are successfully doing it to the rest of the enterprise market and to government agencies and eventually down to small businesses?
Yeah, excellent. That's great.
We could talk about these last poll results, I guess, as a way of closing out.
Yeah, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Interesting results here, right? So we saw, 3 of our 6 respondents said that they're going to implement password management in some form or another. That's great. I hope that the other respondents who didn't say that have already done that. That's the number one place to start. Is probably the single cheapest and most immediately effective thing that you can do for your own security. The vast majority of attacks are still just weak and stolen credentials that have already been compromised and are for sale on the dark web, or not even for sale on the dark web. And in some cases, they are just available for free on these Payspin and other websites. And so you got to start there. I was working an incident recently where the compromise began because somebody was reusing a very simple password for their online accounts for work and at home. And that password led to their organization getting compromised. So that's a great place to begin. I think awareness and training, it's a simple one to implement. It's a harder one to make valuable. Videos and even the neat Defendify posters alone don't cut it, right? Really, you want to be doing the active phishing simulation. So I hope all 5 out of 6 that are planning to do that in this year are going to be doing the phishing simulation to actually test their employees and create the ability to respond when they click on
either a spearfish testing link or a real spearfish. That's critical. And then I think we talked a lot about the importance of EDR. You really need to be moving beyond at this point your static legacy AV and something that's going to be able to detect and give you the ability to respond to next generation threats. And then finally, I think the thing to remember about all these compliance requirements out there is everything on that list and 100 or so other requirements. You need to do all those things to meet CMMC and to get up to the appropriate level. And so, one of the most important things is to figure out whether you're going to fall under the DoD rubric or not. Where do you need to be in your maturity? What kind of threats are you facing? How valuable is your information? What actors and what capabilities are going to come after you? And then build your program around that understanding.
That's great, Rob. Thanks for sharing that. I think what we've seen is, when we talked about 2015 to today is a massive advancement in the need for cybersecurity from where it was before to where it is today. And I want to thank you for, raising the awareness level in small and mid-sized companies. I think, writing your book, joining on these types of webinars and sharing your thoughts is valuable. I think people need to hear it more and more often. And we're going to continue that cybersecurity improvement in small and mid-sized companies and help them protect themselves. Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, happy to do it, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. And thanks to everyone for joining.